Thank you to UNU-WIDER for the invitation. The work I will present today is the long-run effects of cash transfers on labor market outcomes. This is joined with my colleagues at the South African Reserve Bank, Chloe Allison and Catherine Bankart. The usual disclaimer applies. The views here are entirely ours and not that of the SAB. By way of context and motivation, youth employment in South Africa is exceptionally high. The official unemployment rate is 32%, but amongst the youth, those aged 25 to 34, this is almost 40%. So there's really a critical need for us to understand what type of policies can work to reduce youth unemployment in South Africa. Alongside this high unemployment, South Africa also has a fairly extensive social assistance program. And so in our paper, we ask, how do unconditional cash transfers received in childhood improve labor market outcomes in young adulthood? We look specifically at the child support grant, which is actually the largest grant in South Africa in terms of number of beneficiaries covered. And we look at three different labor market outcomes. We look at labor market participation, employment, and wages. There is a lot of work on South Africa included looking at how cash transfers affect labor market outcomes, but these are typically focused on contemporaneous effects and not really trying to understand the long-run effects of early receipt. Much of the evidence on these long-run effects comes from conditional cash transfer programs, especially Mexico's Progresa. And there the effects generally are showing that the long-run effects are positive. So the child support grant in South Africa was introduced in 1998. It is a means-tested unconditional cash transfer. And this is a fairly large transfer. So it is about 40% of median monthly per capita income. And among the poorest households, the child support grant can account for 40% of total household income. When the grant was initially introduced, it was available only to those up to the age of 7. Over the years, this age eligibility threshold was progressively extended, and the grant is now currently available to everyone under the age of 18. These threshold changes generate some exogenous variation in the total months of CSG eligibility across cohorts. So the graph here shows you total months of child support grant eligibility over a lifetime for different cohorts. You can see that for anyone born before May 1991, total eligibility was 0. But as we look at cohorts 91, born later in 1991, 92, 93, 94, and 95, you can see that the total number of months of eligibility is increasing. This eligibility is plausibly exogenous because it is entirely due to when you were born, and all of these cohorts were born before the grant was actually introduced. And so we exploit this variation to try to understand how CSG exposure affects long-run labor market outcomes. In order to do this, we need data that includes month and year of birth, as well as labor market outcomes. And so we use a panel data, the National Income Dynamics Study, NIDS. This is a nationally representative panel data. We use all 5 waves, 2008 to 2017. We restrict our sample to African individuals only because we are observing these individuals during their young adulthood. We cannot see if they were eligible for the grant in terms of the means test in their childhood. But we know from other data sets that, or other sources, that the large majority of African individuals were income eligible for the grant. The cohorts that we look at are 1998 to 1995. The younger cohorts will have 0 eligibility, and the older cohorts will have up to about 15 years of total child support grant eligibility. So there is significant variation here across cohorts in terms of eligibility. We restrict to those who are 18 years and older so that we can study the labor market outcomes during young adulthood, and at a point when no one is still eligible for the grant. We're going to look at 3 measures of childhood grant eligibility. The first is a binary measure, which simply says, were you eligible for the grant or not? And this allows us to capture an average treatment effect for the younger cohorts who receive the grant. But we also allow for 2 continuous measures to study whether treatment effect depends on exposure, so allowing for some heterogeneity here. We use 2 continuous measures. The first is the total months of eligibility during childhood, and the studies where the longer exposure had a larger effect. We also look at the total rand value of grant exposure, and this allows us to also capture the effect of the changing rand value of the grant over time. We study 3 labor market outcomes. We look at labor force participation, and here we use the broad definition, which includes discouraged work seekers, given the high unemployment rate amongst this group. We also look at employment, and we look at the log of wages. Our empirical strategy is a 2-way fixed effects model that exploits this variation in child support grant eligibility across cohorts. So our measure CSG is one of those 3 measures that I spoke about, either the binary measure or the 2 continuous measures. Y are 3 different labor market outcomes, and we control for individual controls, including gender, location, education levels of parents, household size, the number of other CSG eligible children in the household, the number of old age grants eligible individuals in the household, and a full set of province dummies. We include year fixed effects to control for time trends, and we include age fixed effects so that all these comparisons are happening within age groups. So we are comparing, for example, 20-year-olds who were never eligible for the grant with 20-year-olds who had eligibility for the grant during their childhood. We also estimate an additional specification that includes cohort year effects to account for the fact that these cohorts may be experiencing cohort-specific time trends, for example, due to the fact that they enter the labor market at different times. Some technical details. We do use panel weights to account for not selective attrition, and we'll cluster our standard errors at the cohort level, bootstrapping to account for the small number of cohorts. The results. You'll see that generally we find no significant effect. There's one significant effect in there if we look just at the total months of eligibility and labor force participation, but that coefficient is quite small in absolute terms and also small relative to the overall mean, and that significance disappears once we include the cohort year fixed effects. So overall, these results suggest that there is no effect of childhood grant eligibility on long-run labor market outcomes, whether we look at labor force participation, employment, or wages. And these results don't really change after we include the cohort year fixed effects to allow for differential trends across cohorts. We also look at heterogeneous effects. So previous literature in other countries, and South Africa included, shows that there are differential effects across gender and urban-rural location. So we study separately males and females and urban-rural. There were no significant effects for females and rural location. We do see some statistically significant effects for males and urban location, but these are really quite small. And again, these are only significant when we look at the continuous measure, when we look at total months of CSG eligibility. These effects are not significant when we look at the binary measure or when we look at the rand value. So significant only for one of the 3 CSG measures that we look at, and significant only for labor force participation. But these effects are quite small. An extra year of CSG eligibility reduces male labor force participation by just 1.4% relative to the mean. An extra year of CSG eligibility reduces urban labor force participation by 1.6% relative to the mean. And when we include those cohort-specific time trends, these effects are no longer significant. And again, these are not as significant when we look at the other CSG measures or when we look at employment or wages. And so overall, we interpret this as not really showing any effect of the child support grant eligibility during childhood on long-run labor market outcomes. We conduct some robustness checks. So one concern you might have is that CSG eligibility is very closely tied to age. We address that by using a quadratic in age instead of age dummies, so trying to control for age effects in a different way, and the results don't change. We still find that there is no effect on long-run labor market outcomes due to childhood CSG eligibility. We conduct placebo regressions, so we use a group of older cohorts, 1983 to 1990. None of these cohorts were ever eligible for the grant, but we're studying their labor market outcomes at the same time period using NIDS data, and we don't find any significant effects for this cohort either. So our conclusion is that child support grant eligibility during childhood does not improve labor market outcomes in early adulthood. And overall, we do not find any evidence for differential effects by gender or geographic location. Of course, this result could be due to some limitations in our empirical strategy. The first is the time period that we're studying. So it could be that these cohorts are still relatively young. So the youngest cohorts, in related work that I have, I show that the youngest cohorts here, the 1994 to 1995 cohorts, do have increased educational attainment and enrollment during this young adulthood period when they are aged 18 to 23. That is the time period, those are the ages that I'm also seeing them here at the NIDS data. So it could be that we need to study this later on when they are even older. Perhaps there could be some positive effects on the labor market outcomes. The cohorts that we're studying here also don't have complete child support grant coverage. So there are younger cohorts that would have received the grant over their entire childhood. And most of the cohorts that we're studying here have discontinuous child support grant eligibility. So they are falling in and out of eligibility. It is possible that cohorts who received continuous, longer eligibility will show some positive effects on labor market outcomes. But also the results that we have here are actually similar to what other papers have found. So there is work showing that the child support grant has not had any effect on employment outcomes for mothers of children who are eligible for the grant. And Haroon's recent work shows that the social relief of distress grant also does not translate into long-run employment improvements. So taken together, and this is part of that literature that suggests that social assistance, especially in a country like South Africa with high unemployment, is not sufficient to increase labor force participation, employment, and wages. And what we really need to be thinking about are structural labor market issues, improving education and skills attainment, and thinking about improving environments for firms. Thank you.